Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marcus. I'm Director of Immigration Law Clinics at the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law. On behalf of the directors of the Bacon Immigration Law and Policy Program and the co-sponsors for this event, the Immigration Law Association, I am delighted to welcome you all here. There's a wonderful group of law students and faculty and community members in the room. So welcome and thank you for being here, and welcome to all of you who are on Zoom. Especially at this unsettling and critical moment in our nation's history, we are very lucky that Kari Hahn is here to share her information and insights on this topic of immigration and deportation of immigrants without due process and other commentary on recent events. Kari is one of the most experienced immigration litigators in the United States. And I will introduce her in a minute, but before that, I have just a couple of preliminaries. Well, first, I want to thank the Law Clinic administrators, Lee Taylor and Rita Mendez, for handling all the logistics of the briefing speaker series, including this one. They are marvelous, and we are so lucky to have them. Too quick, yes. Back, I think. Quick preliminary notes. First, we're recording this to put on the website. So when we get to the question and answer, if you raise your hand to ask a question, you are consenting to the use of your voice and image for that purpose. If you don't feel comfortable with that, please write your question. There are note cards, and I will get it from you. I will read your question. And as for the structure of the talk, we'll introduce our speakers. So let's talk for around 45 or so. Closer to 55. Closer to 55 minutes, but we will still have probably 10 to 15 minutes of time for question and answer. And ILSA leadership member David Raven is going to monitor the chat. Kari Hahn graduated from Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, and she earned her JD at Columbia Law School. She clerked for Judge Jeremy Fogle in the Central District of California and for Judge Sidney Thomas at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Kari tells me that she did work for a law firm to pay off student loans, but was not able to stand that long enough to get to the annual loan. Instead, she worked for an immigration firm doing immigration lawyer, handling Ninth Circuit appeals, and for a death penalty lawyer in San Francisco. After 2 years, she opened her own practice, was only an immigration practice in Portland, Oregon, which she ran for 7 years, at which point she was hired by Boston College. She was a tenured law professor at Boston College, and she founded their appellate clinic where she supervised law students who handled briefed and argued cases before the Ninth Circuit. She also taught criminal law, family law, and the immigration consequences of criminal convictions. After 10 years at Boston College, Kari began her current job, which is as an appellate attorney for the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project in Arizona. However, she was hired around the time of COVID, so she is able to live in Montana. Over the course of her career, Kari has represented more than 350 immigrants before the Ninth Circuit, 150 people in immigration court, and 50 people in criminal appeals. She has numerous publications, and her commentary has been featured in national outlets, including the New York Times, the LA Times, Washington Post, SCOTUS Blog, and CNN. On a personal note, I have had the pleasure of collaborating with Kari on a couple of cases, law clinic cases involving people who are seeking protection under the United Nations Convention Against Torture. She is always compassionate, supportive, eager to share her work and her knowledge as received today. and practically bursting with enthusiasm at every moment. And finally, on a different topic altogether, Kari is an avid hockey player. And this, as she tells me, makes her an expert on where ice does and does not walk. Joining me and welcoming Kari Hahn.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you, Professor Marcus. Thank you to the law school. Thank you for paralegaling and Ricardo for making this possible today. It's such a pleasure to be here at this moment. My disclaimer is that all opinions that I have, that I say today are mine alone. They should not be attributed to any employer, past or present. I have a 60-year-old son. I think he wishes that I could carry this around. I reply to him as well. Now, today, all of the violence, all of the lawlessness, and irrational, if not even immoral policies that we're seeing in the streets has been at the border. And it's been in detention centers, and it's been in immigration courts since at least 1996. Now, immigration law is an area where information is a mile wide and an inch deep. When our nation, for instance, was debating healthcare, our media actually helped facilitate different discussions about the Swiss model, single payer models, and the advantages of different systems. But most Americans today cannot tell you how people get green cards, how they get asylum, how they become citizens. And when we have the same facts, we can actually work on getting real solutions. So my job today is to give you accurate information. And then I'm going to try to persuade you that the current mass deportation approach is unnecessary, expensive, and harmful. I'm going to propose 7 concrete reforms and dozens of new laws that federal, state, and local officials can enact. I'm going to focus on realistic ways that state and local government can hold accountable those who are planning, permitting, and committing lawless acts and violence. And my larger takeaway is that instead of simply asking ICE to be taken out of cities or returned to just harming immigrants or criminals, or going back to the border, that this is a moment when we can get past slogans and debate the immigration policy that we need as a country. The last time we had immigration reform was 1986. We have been 40 years in the wilderness without humanity, without accountability. And so now that so many Americans are paying attention to what's happening, I believe that we can make changes that are long overdue. If you take anything from this, I hope that you've realized that calling someone illegal does not make them a criminal, does not make them dangerous. It cannot be the basis for the $155 billion our country is spending on this year alone. Likewise, calling an agency law enforcement does not make them capable of following the law or protecting the public. And also my greatest hope is that when people realize that what we are seeing today will not end when Trump administration is over. All that we are seeing started 30 years ago, and there's been 30 years of bipartisan failure, whether it be from intentional cruelty, cowardice, or ignorance. And my greatest hope is that with all that is breaking around us, enough people can stay tuned in. Public outcry and attention was the only means, is the only means to finally get out of this 40 years of wilderness where we have irrational scapegoated immigrants. And my hope that everyone stays angry, everyone stays engaged, and stays focused on what we need to get the practical and needed reforms for a more humane and a more humane and fair immigration policy. So I guess I just gave away the whole ending. But to get to that point now, to the slides, there is a loud and powerful anti-immigrant sentiment across the United States to justify the current policy. As a matter of history, the anti-immigrant sentiment is nothing new to our country. Are there any guesses on who said these quotes? They're on the slides. Those who come hither are the most ignorant and stupid sort of their nation. The Spaniards, Italians, French, Russian, Swedes are too swarthy. being too dark, and so they will never fit in. And then also, why should Pennsylvania become a colony to be Germanized? And because those immigrants can't speak our language. Any guesses on who? Yes.
Andrew Jackson.
No. Earlier. John Adams earlier. Why just around the same time period, not John Adams?
I'm going to guess Benjamin.
Yes, this is Ben Franklin. And he said that in 1750 before we even had a country. He was not happy about the stupid, swarthy Germans, from which I can claim lineage. But on a serious note, what you see then is the same backlash that you see today, where immigrants are foreign. They're different looking. They are darker than us. They cannot assimilate, and they will destroy American values or culture. Now, also throughout history, these anti-immigrant sentiments and the pro-immigrant sentiments have always coexisted. These are two cartoons from 1870, so the same time period. The one on the left is calling out the hypocrisy of those who are trying to limit or end immigration, in that you can see that what is depicted is that the Irish immigrants at the top are literally throwing down the ladder to the wall of the United States and leaving the Chinese immigrants down below without an ability to come to our country. And on the right-hand side, we have the racist depictions warning of Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants who are literally eating Uncle Sam to express the fears and warnings that immigration is going to destroy the United States. Now, the takeaway from both of these sentiments and histories is that we do not need to convince everyone in the United States to support these reforms. And we will not convince everyone to support immigration policies before we move forward. But all we have to do is realize is that these sentiments always have existed, always will exist. And then the question is, do we care enough about immigration reform to work together to make the policies that we want to see happen? Now, in the past, I've given more time to the first 150 years of our immigration policy, and I still think it's relevant, but I'm going to shorten it briefly. 3 quick takeaways from 150 years in 30 seconds is that the United States developed its reputation of being a nation of immigrants because from its very beginning, we were a nation that embraced immigrants. For the first 150 years, we had relatively open borders if you were white. And the concept of deportation, of taking someone outside of the country, was a radical idea that did not appear in our history until 1917. The next point I want to make is that anti-immigrant sentiment, even throughout our history, has never gone away either. It made its way to laws at different points in our history. In 1882, Congress excluded Chinese immigrants from staying in the United States or bringing their family with them when they were done working on the railroad. In 1924, in a famous law authored by the KKK, our country had race-based quotas. And I put race in quotes because during the eugenic era, our country sorted people into ethnic categories that we just do not recognize today. In 1911, there were 45 different races at Ellis Island that the immigration officers would check. Now, as a result, immigrants, especially those from Catholic countries, were considered not white. In 1929, Congress passed an illegal entry and illegal re-entry laws with the express purpose to keep out Mexican immigrants. The third point, though, is in 1952, Congress passed the modern framework of immigration law to reflect the current pillars of family, work, and protection of refugees. As you can see from the chart, from 1952 to 2025, legal immigration reflected a desire to unify countries. 2/3 of all legal immigrants were to family members. About 12 to 50% in any given year were employment, and between 15 and 20% were protections given to those fleeing persecution. Now, in 1952, I also want to note that this law maintained the racial exclusions that existed from 1924 and 1929, President Truman actually vetoed the law because it had the racial exclusions, and Congress overrode his veto with the quotas. And I mention that simply because from our history, it is hard to boast that our family had been better immigrants, that we had done things the right way when actually we had laws that very much had the ugly undertones of racism. Throughout history, the right way of immigrating was often the white way to immigrate. So those of us in the room whose family members arrived before 1965, we very much benefited from these preferences. What was transformative in immigration law was 1965. This was a celebrated milestone in immigration law. This was part of the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights laws acted by President Johnson. This is when race-based quotas finally were eliminated in our immigration law. And there's a debate about whether it was intended or not, but the reality is that that law reshaped the ethnic diversity in the United States. Between 1924 and 1964, 96% of all immigrants were only from certain European countries. After 1965, 75% of immigrants are from Asia, Africa, Central America, and South America. Contrary to what Fox News, Stephen Miller, and every single ad campaign for 2024, there is no evasion of immigrants. From 1990 to 2022, the government granted asylum to between 5,000 and 45,000 people each year. Over 22 years, we've granted asylum to 780,000 people. Trump shut down the border, so right now 0 asylum seekers are entering the country. Anyone who remains has already been in the country and they're going through court proceedings. Now, refugees too are low in numbers. The blue line is how many refugees the president can permit. The orange line is the number of refugees who actually arrive. When Congress first passed this law in 1980, 200,000 refugees were welcomed. And that was under President Reagan, who was the first president to let them in. But again, in 2020 and 2025, Trump shut down refugees. Now there's an asterisk. He has let in 59 white Afrikaners this year. But I should note that those are people that the UN does not recognize and meet the legal definition of refugees. Something that is surprising to me is that in my lifetime, the most welcoming period for immigrants was under President Reagan in the 1980s. Immigrants had a pathway to status. President Reagan granted an amnesty program where 2.9 million people were given status. And by status, I mean green cards to give them a secure pathway to be here and become citizens. The 1980 Refugee Act was passed a year before it came into office, but it created and codified the refugee and asylum protections that we honored. The laws were generous. And to prove this point, on the yellow at the box at the bottom, the slide has a quote from what the official policy memorandum was at the then INS, directing officers to be generous and to overlook problems or defects in any applications so people would be granted status. All of this changed overnight in 1996. Congress passed something called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which is known as IRA. The anti-immigrant sentiment swung back and emerged as the forefront and the basis of our immigration law. IRA is far-reaching, draconian. It was passed without legislative hearings. It was passed without deliberation or debate. It passed in August 1996, which was President Clinton's re-election year. He wanted to move to the right in order to gain voters. In that very same month, he signed in the Rose Garden, DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, to end the welfare in IRA. This is the law that codified the talking point that immigrants were illegal and immigrants were criminal. His own advisors criticized this law as just being too much, but they wanted to win the election by sounding tough on immigration. I cannot emphasize enough how radical a law IRA has been in impacting our policy and the very way we think and talk about immigration. Before IRA, it was pretty easy to get status and a green card. If people were married, they could stay. They had to pay $1,000 fine if they had to cross over the border, but there was a pathway for them to stay. If they were here for 7 years, they just had to show they were contributing to the community, they could get a green card. Everyone could apply for asylum if their life was in danger. Everyone could get a work permit, social security number, driver's license, and they had a hearing. Under IRA, this changed. If you crossed the border, you could not get status, even if you married a citizen. If you left the country, you couldn't come back for 10 years. Marriage was no longer a pathway for anyone to cross the border, and being a good person was no longer rewarded with green cards. Asylum had these arbitrary deadlines and no guarantee to get work permits. And one of the most devastating parts of IRA is called expedited removal. Although I am not a fan of the phrase the worst of the worst, because it really doesn't mean anything, I break that rule to describe expedited removal. Before IRA, every immigrant in the United States had a hearing. And in this hearing, a judge would hear evidence. The person had the right to a lawyer, they had a right to an appeal, and the judge could decide whether they could remain in the United States or be deported. Expedited removal ended that. Suddenly, a process that took months to years would take minutes. One officer could just decide to deport someone without a lawyer, without evidence, without a fact finder, and without an appeal. Now, this was originally limited. In 1996, it was only at the ports of entry along the southern border. 2004, it then expanded to 100 miles of any border. And that sounds limiting until you realize 2/3 of our country lives within 100 miles of any single border. But it was limited to any person who could not prove they had been in the United States for less than 2 weeks. And that's an awkward phrasing, but that's how the law describes it. In Trump's first term, he tested the power of expedited removal with raids in urban areas. I don't know if you remember that. In 2020, there was a case before the Supreme Court called the DHS versus Thurgasian, and SCOTUS said there's no problem with using expedited removal anywhere in the interior. I want to put a writing in 2020 where immigration advocates fear that if the court allows expedited removal to continue, this will produce a papers, please world in which immigration enforcement can stop any of us. And that was dismissed as hysterics. It would never happen. January 2025, Trump changed expedited removal to include any non-citizen who could not prove they were in the United States for less than 2 years. And then January 2026, because no one by sight can tell whether I'm a citizen or not, all of a sudden, this means that expedited removal has provided the legal framework and the pretext to allow ICE to stop everyone. Minnesota is the result of expedited removal. Turning back to IRA. In 1996, this powerful tool took away status, it increased deportations, and it locked up immigrants. The undocumented population jumped from 3.5 million to 12 million. IRA did not end unlawful immigration, but it did create the current 10 million people who are permanently without any status. Now, I will talk about this later, but I want to emphasize that people are not illegal. But IRA is the law that created the problem we are dealing with now. There are no lines. There are no pathways to get status. Individuals are not at fault for this. IRA is the reason why people can't legalize. IRA also increased the number of deportations. It is devastating to emphasize how easy deportations can occur when one immigration officer can make that decision without any guardrails or oversight. And the numbers, these graphs speak for themselves. The chart on the left, which is from 1990 to 2010, a huge jump happened in 1996 because that's when IRA happened to deny people relief who were otherwise getting status. In 1990, the United States deported fewer than 50,000 people a year. By 1997, that had jumped to 125,000 as IRA first years kept climbing upwards. You will also notice on these graphs a second large increase in deportations, and that was under President Obama. In 2009, in his first year of office, he increased deportations to 375,000 people a year. And not only did the number of deportations increase, but the type of deportation. And on the chart on the right, there's the documentation deportations from 2003 to 2024. The blue line are the people who are deported with hearings. The orange line is the people who are being turned away at the border under expedited removal by one officer in a matter of minutes. You will notice a huge increase in the deportations during the Obama years from 2008 to 2015. Now, I will notice people on social media say, well, at least Obama was humane when he deported people. I was there. Every immigration advocate who was there can tell you there was nothing humane about what he did. Obama deported more people in his 8 years in office, 3 million people, than not any other president before him, but all other presidents. He did so by using IRA that let people be denied a hearing, and the orange number. This is what expedited removal is, and this is what it does. Now, Trump changed those rules in 2025, so instead of a Border Patrol officer, an ICE officer now has the authority to administer expedited removal anywhere. And again, I want to emphasize that the violence and the inhumanity that and the lawlessness that we're seeing on the streets of Minnesota have been at the border the entire time. Clinton created the knives. Obama sharpened them. Trump is using them. My thesis is that all of them were wrong. And again, whether it be malice or stupidity, pursuing enforcement-only immigration policy has only weakened our country. This is why the first and most important reform that comes from this time is to repeal IRA and restore pathways for people to have secure and lasting status. And to emphasize how important this is, I'd like to draw from my personal experience. 30 years ago, in 1994, I was a paralegal, fresh out of college, and I joined an immigration law firm. I started this work because I wanted to help people to flee from oppression, and back then, immigration law was fair. In 1994, every client who walked in the door was able to apply for, and if they qualified, they got legal status. Today, in my job, I witnessed human rights abuse. The current administration is using new policies and new practices to hurt my clients and other immigrants. They lock up people with half status. They place them in deplorable and inhuman conditions. They create fast-track kangaroo courts, and they deport people who are contributing to our country. They illegally deport people to third countries and danger zones. All of this did not start in January 2025. The legal framework for all that we're seeing started in 1996 when Congress passed President Bill Clinton signed IRA, and this is why IRA was repealed. The second proposed reform is to invest in immigration courts. There are 800 positions for immigration judges across the country. There is one board called the Board of Immigration Appeals, or BIA, that looks at all the appeals from these immigration courts, and then the federal courts can review the decisions of the BIA. There are 4 main problems with immigration courts today. The first is that these courts are very informal. The now retired immigration judge Dana Lee Marks, 2014, wrote an op-ed lamenting that immigration court is death penalty case in traffic. The non-citizen does not have an attorney. Hearings are informal. It usually lasts 3 hours, and judges have not been given the support to research, prepare, and write decisions. A second failing of immigration courts is that Congress has never adequately funded them. In 2024 alone, Congress spent $9.4 billion for ICE, which is in the line, 7.3, which is the dark blue line for Border Patrol, 3.2 billion on detention, and 84 million on the immigration courts, which is the green line on the far right. 424 million has gone to asylum officers. This disparity, as you can see from the chart for 20 years, is not new to Trump. This chart documents the money given to immigration priorities in the last 20 years. And the funding has always increased for ICE and Border Patrol, which are the 2 blue lines. But this, and I want to emphasize that the money that we spent in proportion to immigration courts where people can actually get status, it's just a drop in the bucket. This problem has been 20 years in the making. And Congress will not give money to immigration judges because when you give the money for hearings, people will get status. The lack of funding has resulted in historic backlogs. In 1999, there were 125,000 cases waiting to be heard. By 2009, there were 240,000. If you look at the first blue graph on the top, that's from 2012 to 2005. In January 2017, when Trump first came to office, 500,000 cases were waiting to be heard. By January 2025, that number was 3.7 million. Now, the cost of this delay is staggering. The wait time for hearings can be 3 to 7 years. Sometimes people can get work permits, sometimes they can't. When people win on appeal, they have to get back in line and wait for a new year to begin this process. My longest case was 27 years before the family finally got a claim. Not all cases are that long, but I have a number of cases that are 10 to 15 years old and counting. And they ultimately will end with a green card or asylum. So this is really just a wasteful exercise. In 2026, Trump intentionally increased these wait times. He didn't hire new judges, and he forced each judge just to close 700 cases each year or be fired. And Trump, again, I want to emphasize that did not start this problem, but Biden did not do anything to end it. On the graph on the blue at the bottom is the quarterly increases from cases from 2016 to 2024. Each quarter had an increase of wait times and more cases. And again, Biden did not hire judges, and Biden did not create policies to actually help these backlogs. Now, the third and most pressing problem with the immigration courts is that they are not dependent. Some immigration judges call themselves imitation judges in protest. They are lawyers, they are not judges. Federal and state judges have no boss, no one to report to. Immigration judges report to the Attorney General. Now think about it. Would you walk into court knowing that the same person who is the boss of the prosecutor is the boss of the judge? Not fair. Twice in history, the president has interfered with this lack of independent immigration. Under George Bush, there is now a quaint hiring scandal when Monica Goodling hired judges based on their stated political preference. In 2022, Attorney General Ashcroft fired 1/3 of the BIA members based on who had granted cases. Chairman Paul Schmidt, who was one of those fired, publicly said that he believed those colleagues who had remained changed their votes in order to keep their jobs. And his observation played out. From statistics from the Los Angeles Times, the denial rate at the board went from 59% denials to 86%. And again, in January 2025, Trump has weaponized Black independence. 13 of 28 of the BIA members were fired in February of this year. Every single one was a Biden appointee. Over 100 judges have been fired, and only those with grant rates favoring immigrants or had a background in immigration defense are those who are being targeted. In San Francisco, there used to be 21 judges. There are now only 4. Trump is using immigration judges to deprive people illegally of their hearings. We saw this in May and June and July. People showed up at court. They had an asylum hearing. If they were allowed to go forward in 3 hours, they would have had asylum and walked out with status. Instead, the DHS moved to dismiss the case, put them in expedited removal. And typically, what would happen, though, if that happened a year ago, the case would be dismissed. They'd be allowed to go home. They could file for asylum from there, start the process at the asylum officer. Now, instead, the judges would grant those motions, and ICE would be sitting in the hallway and then arrest them before they had a chance to file any paperwork. The American Life has a recent episode. The judges who went along with this have now spoken up and said that they were wrong to follow that and allow that to happen. They were afraid of losing their jobs. They lost their jobs anyway, so they were speaking out. In the fall of 2025, there was a new memo telling all judges to dismiss asylum cases from Central America and Latin America so the DHS can send someone to Honduras, Ecuador, or Uganda to apply for asylum there. Now, this is blatantly illegal, but again, because the judges are afraid of losing their jobs, if they do not go along with this, they are granting those motions and people are not even getting the silent hearings in the United States. Here it is a bill that was proposed in 2022, sponsored by Zoe Lofgren. It is a concrete example of how immigration courts can be independent and can have their funding increased. The third reform I want to highlight is there is a need to fund immigration lawyers. The single greatest predictor of winning this one case was whether someone had an attorney. Professor Ingrid Eagley and Stephen Schaefer looked at 1.2 million cases from 2017 to 2007 to 2012 and found that for immigrants, if they had a lawyer, they were twice as likely to win. If they were detained, that jumped to 5 times greater to win if they had a lawyer. For children, and yes, there are children who have to represent themselves in the immigration court starting as young as 6 months. Do anyone have the guesses of what that rate of success would be for a child to represent themselves?
Around 0%.
Yeah, it's between 0 and 1%. And then when there's a lawyer, what are the rates?
95%.
90. So these results have been repeated in numerous studies, and just want to have a shout out to the Florence Project, who would kind of pioneered this work and provided universal education. They were one of the first organizations to provide representation to children. But as you can see, the importance of the role of the cannot be emphasized enough. Here's a chart, again, these statistics from Connecticut for 20 years. The line in purple is grants with lawyers. The line of orange, which you can barely look at, is people who were able to win without a lawyer. And you can't even see that the orange is on the chart. Among the cases, again, so that's 97% of all cases that granted had a lawyer. In a 20-year study, then someone that was 10.5 times more likely to win if they had a lawyer if they didn't. And it's another fact, between 70 and 80% of all immigrants in the court systems do not have lawyers. Powell v. Alabama was a 1932 Supreme Court case that created the federal right for an accused to consult with a lawyer in death penalty cases. There, the Supreme Court explained that lawyers are needed because in criminal court, quote, though he be not guilty, the layman faces the danger of conviction because he does not know how to establish his innocence. Immigration courts prove how important it is to have a lawyer to make sure people who are eligible actually can establish their right to remain. For over 20 years, Congress followed this model and in a bipartisan manner invested in giving money to nonprofits to provide legal advice and limited services in detention. Again, another shout out to the Florence Project for innovating that program. The funding was approved each and every year because it actually saved taxpayer money by helping the courts figure out who had a strong case, who had a weak case. If people had a strong case, the lawyers could then help give them information to prepare their case. If they didn't have a case, the lawyer could advise the person that they're without luck and then help them figure out how to end their case without the resources needed to go through a full hearing. Now, Congress also spent money for nonprofits to represent children. And again, before this program, 20 years ago, children's cases were either denied at that 1%, or if they were granted, it was their trafficker who would appear in court as their lawyer. So they would either be denied and deported or released into the custody of the child trafficker. Nonprofits, again, changed the grant rates from 1% to over 99%. And the children were not released into human trafficking, but were released into their families and communities. DOGE ended both of these programs in March of 2025. Congress then ended it in January of 2025. For the first time, Congress did not renew the funding that had been supporting immigrants for over 20 years. So the reforms are needed to restore these programs. There's also a bill call to make universal representation a reality. Here are an example of 2 bills that have been already introduced to Congress. The first one, the SHIELD Act, would give money for the criminal justice system. I have a 67-year-old client who's a musician. He opened up for Stevie Wonder. In his 40s, he was in a car accident. Instead of having the matter be deemed an accident or be charged as vehicular manslaughter, he was Black, was charged with attempted murder. I have a client, age 65, who got in an argument with a police officer during a DUI. And the argument escalated and the police started punching my client. The police broke my client's ribs. And in so doing, the officer broke his hand. My client was charged with assault with causing bodily injury because, according to the prosecutor, his ribs broke the hand of the police who was punching him. Simply put, when immigration law tries to graft punishment onto crimes and tries to guess who's serious or who's dangerous, its error rate is simply too high. Collateral damage from IRA is the separation and heartache brought to the elderly parents, young children, employers, and communities that rely on these people's gifts. By using a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel, IRA recklessly metes out punishment without regard to the purpose or impact. And before IRA, immigration law was not punishment. Before 1990, in criminal court, people could ask for something called the JRAD, the Judicial Recommendation Against Deportation, which meant a state or federal judge could issue an order preventing that person from ever being deported for that crime. Before 1996, immigration court, when everyone had a hearing, the person could weigh the facts of the crime versus the equities of that person and any proof of rehabilitation and contribution to the community. Lastly, the most disturbing part about IRA is that these crimes will result in deportation, no matter how minor, no matter whether there's proof of rehabilitation, no matter whether they were even expunged or vacated. These convictions, which I call zombie convictions, mean that even if a state or federal court has said that someone is so rehabilitated that they deserve to have it vacated, they continue to exist in immigration law, and IRA will deport. That is the criminal alien, the criminal immigrant that they were talking about. States can help out with this. States, Massachusetts funds experts who give calls for public defenders to make sure a plea deal will not have immigration consequences. States also have stepped up and responded to these zombie convictions. In 2017, California passed a law that lets non-citizens vacate their convictions if they did not understand that their conviction will result in deportation. And IRA also includes minor crimes through a typo. The old law said that only crimes that had more than 365 days as punishment would be aggravated felonies. IRA changed that so that felonies are all of a sudden 365 days or more. So there's a 1 day difference. And as a result, IRA captures in misdemeanors as aggravated felonies and as what it deems the worst of the worst. So the reality is that under Trump and Vance and many others, you will hear that they justify the time and money spent on deporting criminals and also everyone who they say is a legal immigrant. But I would have 4 points I'd like to make in response to that. Now, first, as a technical matter, if someone breaks into my house, they are a burglar and they will be convicted and punished. In immigration law, if someone enters the country or violates immigration law, they are never punished in immigration court. Rather, if they qualify for asylum or green card, someone who crossed the border or violated immigration law walks out with status. That is why I personally use the term pre-legal instead of illegal to describe immigrants. Second, the term illegal immigration is finally being questioned. In October 10th, 2025, a dairy farm in South Dakota, who actually are Kristi Noem's neighbor, had their 50 employees audited for the first time ever by the DHS. After the audit, only 16 workers remained. In response, the South Dakota Farmers Union president asked 2 very important questions in the newspaper article that I quote. The first is, quote, why the heck can't we continue to use them here as an intern or apprentice or whatever? Why do you have, and do whatever you want and just call it and make it legal? Calling a group of needed workers illegal is silly. Instead of trying to deport the illegals, we could make all immigrants in the United States illegal. We could give them amnesty. That is what Reagan did in 1886 when he gave amnesty to 2.9 million people. So the problem that we have in our country is about illegal immigration. We can solve that quickly by just making everyone legal. The farmer's second question, though, is much more interesting to me. He said, why is it so important you grab them and call them a criminal? Finally, someone is saying the emperor has no clothes. By asking why we call immigrants illegal and then think we're justified in spending billions of dollars to deport them, this South Dakota farmer has done more to question our country's unquestioned commitment to deporting people who we actually need in our country. So the slippery slope of who is an illegal immigrant, if it's defined by Trump or MAGA, is very dangerous. If you look at these headlines in the last 12 months, the immigration crackdown is supposed to be against the worst of the campaign trail. Then it became targeting all the illegal immigrants, which changed in numbers from 11 million to 30 million. Then that turned to people with status, and that was status that Trump took away. Tom Homan, who's in charge of ICE, the border czar, announced early on that ICE absolutely would go after now legal immigrants. In March 2025, ICE began to arrest students and turned away tourists who criticized American foreign policy and criticized Trump. By May 2025, we were arresting mayors, judges, and congressmen. By September 2025, ICE was all of a sudden hunting, arresting, detaining, beating up citizens who are people of color. And again, ICE doesn't have the legal authority to even talk to citizens. ICE started giving out a $130 fine to a citizen who's not carrying proof of citizenship. They made that up. And now if you look at the last headlines, October, ICE has a mandate to now go after Antifa. October 28th, ICE pointed a gun at a U.S. veteran and said, "You're dead liberal." October 30th, the Pentagon is mobiling for reaction forces to go after dissent. And in the news, after the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, Noam Miller and others kept calling them domestic terrorists. That is not an insult. That is an intentional choice, and they are making a legal argument. In September 2025, Trump issued an executive order defining what domestic terrorists are. And now for the lawyers in the room, we all know that executive orders are basically Post-it notes, just kind of writing down your thoughts, like Dear Diary entry. They have no legal independent meaning on their own. They can direct an agency to do one thing or another, but they have no force of law outside of that. But our country has deferred, and our media pretends that the executive order is somehow binding or forceful. It is not a law. It should not be followed, and there's no reason to follow it. But in this executive order, it's very important that Trump then define who is a domestic terrorist. And the definition is now there. I copied it on the board, but in summary, it is anyone who's anti-American, anti-Christian, has extreme views on race, gender, immigration, opposes the traditional family. Under this executive order, ICE is authorized to target domestic terrorists. So Trump is scapegoating a vulnerable population for harm. And he's doing this and it's completely out of the authoritarian playbook. The cartoon captures how scapegoating immigrants has been very effective in channeling resentment towards immigrants instead of the powerful forces that are reorganizing society to reflect their own interests. The term illegal immigrant has been a 30-year experiment that is exposed to simply no longer be consistent with democratic principles. Hannah Arendt, who's a Jewish scholar who fled Nazi Germany, she wrote books later asking why and how could so many Germans look away. Her answer is that Hitler and Stalin targeted immigrants as criminals. Because when you call someone a criminal, society will assume that whatever you do to them is somehow justified. That's why it was so easy to slide into concentration camps and later mass killings. The problem of dehumanizing people is that when the public can be convinced that a certain group of human beings are inferior, it also permits those totalitarian leaders to convince those same people that the chosen leaders are gods. It is not a coincidence that Trump is attacking birthright citizenship, DEI, and all other measures that protect all of us to be equal and have a role in our society. This is what makes democracy unique. Immigration is what makes the United States unique. An attack on immigrants is now seen as an attack on democracy. As a third point, even though crossing the border is not punished in immigration court, as mentioned before in 1929, our criminal laws have prosecuted people for illegal entry, who cross the southern border for the crime of illegal entry. Now, our history is rife with examples where actions that are legal are not morally right. Slavery was legal, domestic violence was legal, segregation was legal, and everything that became legal. Here is a picture from The Sound of Music. This is when the Von Trapp family were illegal immigrants by crossing the border into Austria. Except that this is the ending of the film, and the audience is in tears, and they're cheering that the families fled Nazi oppression. And so it's very important to realize that the work of illegal immigration is that it very much hides the fact that immigrants who flee persecution and poverty have lived the cherished values and bring the deep-seated commitment to democratic ideals for rebuilding their lives in this country. The term illegal immigrant makes a group of people dangerous outsiders when those people have been shown to be the brave ones who are the best of our country's ideals and the best of what our country can do for others. Given that the term illegal immigrant is basically a moral argument, it's time to challenge it. As a moral matter, Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate, political activist, Holocaust survivor, joined the U.S. immigration advocacy movement with the call that no human is illegal. And as a religious matter, there are 37 verses commanding people to welcome foreigners. So the current 30-year campaign that criminalizes the very best parts of being an American is untenable and must end. My next reform is to abolish ICE. Now, I started giving this talk a year ago, and this was the part of the program where the audience thought I was going too far. I now believe that this reform is the one that everyone actually agrees with. We all know that ICE is not arresting people with crimes. By their own statistics, fewer than 1/3 of anyone arrested had a prior criminal conviction. Fewer than 1% have a conviction for sexual assault, kidnapping, and homicide. It should be noticed that ICE has two subunits. That HSI is the group that actually tracks international crime. In February 2025, DOJ reassigned all the HSI to be on the deportation force and just arrest people in the interior. Under Trump, starting in May 2025, the FBI, DEA, and other agencies refocused on immigration. By October 2025, half of all FBI agents are working on immigration. 87% of all ICE agents are actually working for other federal agencies. It's not surprising when you take cops off the beat, the crime grows. Under the U.S. Sentencing Commission, 80% of all drug smugglers are U.S. citizens. That's true for fentanyl and every other drug. It's not surprising when you close SI and then you reassign FBI that the federal engagements into the prosecutions that actually drive crimes have been falling, and cartels are actually increasing the flow of drugs in the past year. So the first point, this obsession over immigration, is diverting resources and attention on real crime. So let's start with who ICE is arresting. This is now common knowledge. They are arresting people who are praying in churches, college students, elementary children, daycare workers, and people who immigrants who are reporting at the interviews. They are arresting people who are a firefighter, a Harvard researcher, pastor, farm workers, and tourists. They are arresting victims of crimes. They're arresting family members of veterans, and they're arresting beloved community members, such as the tamale vendors in Chicago. We know all of these deportations are causing economic harm. From Trump's first term, there were over 900,000 doctors, scientists, and engineers who were deported or kept out. Economists estimate that the loss to our country was $9.1 billion. And in part, we have an ongoing 10 million job shortage in our country. Under the second term, economists estimate that the current rate of deportations, we will have a 15 million worker shortage. Now, despite knowing this, in 13 months, we're seeing the adverse impact of the aggressive immigration. Immigration policies hurting large industries. The H-1B program places more doctors in rural America than any other program. Tourism produces $2.3 trillion to the economy, creates 9.5 million jobs, but all of those are being lost under this aggressive deportation. Immigration, arrests, and deportations are causing food to rot in the fields. Canada is taking our undocumented workers and building their houses and their construction. Restaurants are under duress and are closing. Now, during that campaign, Trump and Vance justified the immigration crackdown only for the reason that, quote, they were eating the cats and they were eating the dogs. This was false. This was dehumanizing. And it was also targeted at the Haitian community in Springfield, Ohio, who were all given status under Biden. Since Trump came to office, he took away status from those Haitians. The governor of Ohio and local businesses lament that there's now a loss of workers who had been rebuilding the community, churches, and schools. They are moving to Canada, bringing their talents there. Ohio is now worse off. Agent ICE is also an agency that's filled with a history of corruption and abuses that run to the very top. In the first Trump term, ICE lied to the courts, they lied to the public. In 2018, the ICE spokesman resigned while speaking to reporters on his inability to keep lying. In 2025, the news and the court cases are filled with how ICE continues to lie. And in height of the irony, this agency is filled with people who themselves are committing crimes and abuses. Jen Budd, who I know is a local activist, she's a former Border Patrol officer, has a Substack detailing these matters. By April 2025, she documented 120 arrests of Border Patrol and ICE officers for serious crimes. Rodney Scott, head of the Border Patrol, he's alleged to cover up a report of one patrol officer raping another. Tom Holman, who's in charge of ICE, in September, there was reports showing that under the DOJ, it closed its bribery investigation into him after he accepted $50,000 of cash from undercover FBI agents. Now, ICE is very much engaged in lawless violence and is a dangerous force. We all know this. So I'm going to skip through the headlines. We know that ICE is engaged in violence. We know that ICE is endangering children and endangering the public. We all know that ICE is using masks, violence, and military equipment to intimidate people. And we also know ICE is an armed militia that only answers to Trump. He's shamelessly using this force against his political enemies, as seen by Bondi telling ICE that Minnesota that ICE will withdraw once they give her their voter rolls. Now, many centrists defend ICE as law enforcement, but just as the term illegal immigrant is a dangerous way to target people as criminals, the term law enforcement should not be used to describe this agency. We finally had a public outcry to abolish ICE, and I want to emphasize that that is not a slogan. It is a serious policy proposal that I hope can finally happen. One reason why we're in the situation is ICE never had a mission. It was created in 2003. The government can deport people before ICE and will deport people without it. It was created in 9/11 and it just began by starting investigating Muslims. It hasn't gotten better since. Now, despite no mission or oversight, Congress keeps getting that money. This chart has budgets from 23 to 2024. What you can see is that the funding went from 3.3 billion 2003 to 9.5 billion in 2024. And in July, that went to 28 billion. So it tripled not only 20 years, but in 1 year it tripled. The 10 billion that's Congress wants to give it by Friday is 10 billion more. It's not to take away funds. It's not to close ICE. It's much to grow their budget, then grow from 28 billion to 38 billion. To put this into perspective, ICE is now the largest funded federal agency. Among all the countries that spent money on the military, ICE would be number 13 of having the largest military in the world. There is an outcry to finally abolish ICE. Even Bill Kristol, who used to be chief of staff of Dan Quayle, is one of the most consistent critics of this agency. It's also important when people say it's law enforcement and they just need training, it's important to ask what exactly is their mission and what are they supposed to be doing. As Jen Budd has been articulating, their training is to do exactly this. You can't give them cameras for money. And make it more blunt, the problem with the German Gestapo was not the lack of training. It's important to turn questions back to this force and think about why are people even existing? Why does this force exist? In the wake of the killing, though, of ICE killing the two citizens in Minnesota, Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance is suggesting that ICE has, quote, absolute immunity. This is not true. A couple of years ago in Montana, a Bureau of Immigration Affairs agent was investigating child abuse and he raped the woman. Montana prosecuted him, and the same is true with ICE. People need to know that state and county prosecutors have the legal right and legal authority to prosecute any federal agency who breaks the state law. There needs to be public pressure on the state and local attorneys to do this. Now, that said, what we saw in Minnesota was the DHS actively preventing them from committing these crimes. And this is why I think it's very important to see the critical value of criminal law is deterrence. People have to know that there are consequences for their actions or they will keep killing people knowing that the federal government will protect them. Illinois, that state legislature introduced a bill saying that anyone who's currently employed from ICE will be forever barred from ever becoming a state police officer in Illinois. I think it's very important that every state and city goes further. Everything that we did against drug users and sex offenders, we need to do against ICE. We need to have laws banning them from future state employment, student loans, creating a public registry, and don't let them live near schools or public parks. We need to tell ICE officers that if they continue to do their jobs, they will not have future employment. That is the only way to stop them from doing what they do. There also can be new laws. California passed a law banning a federal state officer to wear a mask. And also, this is a very important point, ICE is tracking people through cell phone data to track everyone's location without a warrant. Now, technically, they and the local police can do this. Peter Thiel's company, Palantir, is gathering and selling all of our cell phone data. In May of 2025, Montana was the first state in the country to ban its state police from using cell phone data. Every state and city must do the same, and not just outlaw their state law enforcement from using the cell phone data, but federal government should not be using our cell phone data absent a criminal warrant. Now, the sixth reform is to end immigration detention. Immigration detention is unnecessary. In 1983, we only had 35 immigrants in detention. It was always after their hearings were done. In IRA, that jumped to 7,000 people. And then by what has been happening since is that the detention numbers have only been increasing. We now, under IRA, the jump started in lot of immigrants who usually hovered between 30 and 40,000 people a year. The first Trump administration jumped to 50,000. Today, in 2025, it was 60,000. And beginning in July, Congress has authorized 190,000 people to be locked up in detention. Now, as a reminder, 71% of detained immigrants had no criminal records, but Congress nonetheless is giving $185 billion for this project to continue. To give you a perspective of that money, universal college for all Americans would be $58 billion. We could pay for everyone's college education 3 times over with the money we're spending on DHS. We could fund SNAP for 2.5 years for everyone. Now, despite the money, these conditions are deplorable. There are reports that immigrants have their hands shackled behind their backs while eating. We're locking up children, family, elderly, pregnant women. There is physical abuse. There's sexual abuse against children. This has been happening for years and will increase because, again, DOJ fired all the inspectors general who had oversight over these conditions. Preventable deaths are occurring and increasing. And so the question is, why will our country continue to spend so much money on immigration detention, which is not necessary, wasteful, and causes harm? The simple answer is money. The majority of facilities are being operated by private companies. The CEO of CoreCivic operates 90% of all immigration detentions. Returning to the Tom Homan scandal where undercover agents gave up $50,000 and a bag of cash. Putting aside the moral character, the scandal is the FBI agents were posing as business executives from private detention companies to get a contract and to expand detention when would be elected by Trump. So it's very important that the larger scandal, the lucrative revolving door between Gates and companies, that is reform that can be followed. It's also important that the state government can be regulating and taxing these detention centers. And that is a reform that we can all undertake at the local level. Now, the final reform that I want to end with is that it's important to increase immigration. The stats speak for themselves. Our country actually needs more immigrants. There's a misconception that immigrants take jobs from Americans, but the reality is immigrants create jobs for Americans. Immigrants pay taxes, our economy runs on small businesses, and immigrants are twice as likely as Native Americans to start small businesses. When Social Security will be depleted without immigrants by 2030. And of the 1 million immigrants Biden gave status to, 87% were working age and paying into the Social Security system. Trump eliminated their status. Other concrete reasons to support immigrants: 1 out of every 4 Americans is an immigrant or child of an immigrant. 83% of the top high school science students are children of immigrants. 2025, half of our U.S. Nobel Prize winners were immigrants. So I want to leave with 3 final points. The first is from President Ronald Reagan. In his last speech in office, when awarding Mike Mansfield the Presidential Medal of Freedom, he invoked the Statue of Liberty as being a reminder that we have a compact with our parents, grandparents, and ancestors to accept more immigrants and to accept more asylum seekers. He explained that immigrants are the ones who renew American values, democracy, hard work, religious freedom, and family. He said, "We lead the world because unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength from every country, every corner of the world." He said that the U.S. attracts new ideas and new people, and that's what makes us succeed. I want to leave you with something that he said in a speech that's haunted me for a number of years. Reagan warned that if we were ever to close our doors to immigrants, our leadership in the world would be lost. Our current country's decline in civil discourse and democratic norms declined when we curtailed immigration in 1996. In October of this year, Johan Norberg observed that all great societies thrive when they're open to migration because it brings in new ideas and new people that leads innovation and reinvention. The reverse is true. When people started shutting their doors, they also started collapsing inward. In the Declaration of Independence, the colonies called on King George a tyrant because he did not let people become citizens. He did not permit immigration, ordered armed troops among the public, deprived people of fair trials. They sent people beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses. The threat to democracy, 1776, is the same threat in 2025. The aggressive enforcement actions of Lisbon that immigrants are a threat to democracy, when the threat to our country has been a legal system that's denied a pathway to millions, that we have an armed ICE officers roaming our streets, and we have a deportation scheme that seeks to tear apart communities, industries, and families. So my hope is that we can rebuild our nation and for protection of democracy. We have to remember that welcoming immigrants is an important and valuable step of that project. So I want to leave with the words of the great late Jane Goodall. She eloquently explained that hope is not a wish, hope is a verb, a call to action. I gave them things that were a dozen ideas of what we can all do for immigration. So it's important that we all get to work and to inspire us on cleaning up Doyle. That's what we've taken in Minnesota. If you look on the right, that is an elderly woman using a walker. It is cold, it is icy, and she is marching to tear gas. Minnesota is showing us that caring for our neighbors brings out our very best. It's time for our country to make that our immigration policy again. So that is immigration history in 200 years. It's going to end with some resources. People are asking where to find information. For ongoing information, follow Jen Bud on Substack. She's excellent at giving information and news. There's also an organization, I'm also asked many times, what organizations can people donate to or support? I have started a fundraiser. My shirt says hockey, the only place I belong. You can get that with margaritas, glazers, pina coladas. It's on a website called immigrantsrus.com. All the profits go to, there's a list of nonprofits that I encourage you to look at, circulate, donate directly to. And if you want a t-shirt, sticker, or hoodie, please feel free to have fun with that.